This conference will now be recorded.
Good morning, everybody. You're listening to Money Matters. I'm Chris Hensley. We have a fantastic show lined up for you today. Our guest is Jeff Goodell. He is the author of the new book, The Heat Will Kill You First, Life and Death on a Scorched Planet. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Happy to be here.
And I'll do a little quick monologue here. So I wanted to share your bio with listeners. Jeff Goodall is a renowned author and journalist known for his extensive work on climate change and environmental issues. His latest book is The Heat Will Kill You First: Life and Death on a Scorched Planet. He has been covering climate change for over 2 decades at Rolling Stone and has appeared on various media platforms discussing climate and energy issues. Jeff, welcome once again. I do want to share with listeners, we have kind of a theme going here. It wasn't on purpose, but last week we actually did a show on home generators, and it was called Surviving the Storm. So we're here in Houston, and there's a generator group that's national, and it's kind of set up for when there's storms and that kind of thing. And being in Texas, the power grid going out and stuff. So this seems to go really well with that. And then I was looking for, well, what can I do to kind of make it timely? And usually I'll look for like a story or something like that. All I had to do was check the weather this week. So I pulled
No.
up Phoenix, and there's an excessive heat warning in Phoenix today. They're expecting degrees of 112 degrees through Wednesday. So I thought that was a good way to start it. But Jeff, tell me a little bit why you wrote this book. What inspired you to write this book?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. It's great to be here to talk with you. Funny that you mentioned Phoenix just now. The forecast that I just saw went up to actually 117 this week, which
Holy
is
smokes.
record breaking. And I bring that up because it was actually a visit to Phoenix about 4 years ago. That inspired this book. I was there for to do some reporting on a different story, and it was a 115-degree day, and I had to walk about 12 blocks downtown. And as many people may know, cities are even hotter than the sort of general air temperature because the asphalt and the concrete radiates the heat out. So I don't know how hot it was exactly where I was when I was walking, but I had to walk like 12 blocks downtown, and I felt myself getting dizzy and like I felt my heart pounding, and I thought, oh my God, what is happening to me? And I realized at that kind of moment, the power of heat to affect our bodies and our health. And I had been writing about climate change. I've been writing about climate change for a couple of decades, but I had never really thought about how dangerous heat is. And that experience in Phoenix made me think differently about it. And it made me think, oh my God, I don't, we all bat around this phrase global warming, and it sounds like this sort of gentle thing about, better beach weather. And in fact, heat is a very dangerous thing. And so I set out to kind of explore that in this book.
Well, and when we say that you've written on climate change in the past, I mean we left out the introductions by Al Gore and Naomi Klein. So this is a space you worked in, but the heat part of it, what a timely thing for this heat wave in Texas that we're experiencing. Now, do you live in Austin as well?
Yeah, I do. I live in Austin. I'm just here in Washington for some book events.
Fantastic. So one of the questions I wanted to ask you is, how does this rising heat reveal kind of the fault lines in government, politics, economy, and values? As you wrote the book, tell us a little bit about that.
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, one of the powerful things about heat is the way it does reveal these fault lines. I think there's a common view of a lot of people, probably a lot of people who are listening to this podcast, that heat's not a big deal because we all have air conditioning. We're just going to turn up the air conditioning, and our power bills will be a little bit more and all that, but it'll be fine. And I think one of the myths that I'm trying to explode in this book is that we will not be fine. First of all, you and I and many of the listeners may have air conditioning and be in air conditioning, in fact, right now. but billions of people on this planet do not have air conditioning and do not have access to air conditioning. Or even kind of more heartbreakingly to me, they may have an air conditioner, but they can't afford to turn it on. Or they can only afford to turn it on for an hour or so a day. So they're putting them, they're constantly making kind of arbitrage between, do I spend money on food, or do I spend money on heat, on cooling myself down? And if they make the wrong calculation, they can die, right? Because of the extreme heat in some of these places. So that's one important aspect. Other important aspect, there's two other points. One is that we can't air condition, heat affects it's not just about us and our bubble. It affects every living thing on the planet has this sort of thermal zone. So for example, I did a lot of reporting in Texas in the Rio Grande Valley and other places on the heat impact on food crops. And, there's especially really important crops like corn in Texas are at the edge of their thermal limits. And when it gets too hot, they die. And, if our summers as they are get consistently hotter, corn will not grow in Texas anymore. And other crops are facing the same thing. So you have this, we're not going to air condition the wheat fields and cornfields, right? I mean, so it has impacts on our food prices, on our food productivity. It has impacts on how diseases are spread, because mosquitoes and other insects and other creatures, one of the things that happens as our world gets hotter is things move and migrate. And as they move and migrate, whether they're human beings or mosquitoes or birds or whatever they are, they carry the microbes that they came from with them, and they bring them into new places. And this is one of the ways that new diseases are spread. But the last most important thing that goes to your opening thing about generators last week is that, yeah, you're good in air conditioning right now. And, I was in Austin yesterday and it was 104 when I left. And I don't know what it is right now, but it's been hot for the last couple of weeks, really hot. And, you know, and all of us who live in Texas remember the power outages a couple of years ago in the winter. During these heat waves, there's been enormous strain on the grid because everyone's cranking up their air conditioning. And so if we have a massive blackout during one of these heat waves or one of these extreme temperature days, a lot of people are going to die. And there's no question about that. So this thing that we're all going to be okay because we have air conditioning is just um, a terrible fallacy that we need to think more broadly about. And, we're not okay.
That's a lot that you shared with us. Just that idea that we're okay because we have the air condition, and there are so many things that we're not. The idea of the food supply chain. If it gets hot enough, you mentioned corn here in Texas, the diseases. I was going to ask you about that because that's something you write about extensively in the book, and I didn't realize how that worked. Can you elaborate just a little bit more on that? How the heat could also play into future pandemics or disease and that sort of thing?
Sure. So one of and this is very much a Texas story. I spent a lot of time actually in Houston, going out with public health officials, trapping mosquitoes, because mosquitoes are exquisitely sensitive to temperature range. They are little creatures that are, as we all know, very mobile, can move around very easily. They're not like a pine tree that is stuck in one place and can't easily get up and move to somewhere cooler or warmer. Mosquitoes can move very, very easily, and they carry a lot of different diseases, dengue fever, Zika, and just the last couple of weeks, we've seen a resurgence of malaria in the southern United States, in Texas and Louisiana, and that has been eradicated from the United States for decades. Malaria is still a huge problem in the world. 400,000 people or so die a year from malaria in Africa. But in the US, it's pretty much unheard of. You living in Houston and I living in Austin, I don't worry if I get bit by a mosquito that's going to be carrying malaria. But now it's coming back. And, the causes are complicated, but heat is a big factor. because as it gets a little bit warmer, the range of the kinds of mosquitoes that are carrying these diseases expands. And so, you know, a perfect example of this is Mexico City. Mexico City has a kind of coolish Mediterranean climate that basically is just a little bit, has always been a little bit too cool for any mosquitoes. Anyone who's spent any time there, my wife is from Mexico City, and so we spend a lot of time there. And there's basically no mosquitoes there. There has never been historically. So there's none of these malaria, dengue, Zika, anything. But it's gotten a couple degrees warmer there because of the warming climate. And now mosquitoes are beginning to move in and they're carrying these diseases. So suddenly you have a city of 30 million people that is now vulnerable to these diseases that they have basically, not thought about protections for. They don't have screens on their windows. They just, in the way that you and I, who have lived in a place that has mosquitoes, we have some protections up from them. A place like Mexico City, you have a lot of really vulnerable people who are now all of a sudden exposed to these diseases that are carried by these. So that's, one classic example. The other classic example is ticks. Lyme disease in the northwest or northeast, starting out down on Long Island, but now moving all the way up into Vermont and Canada because it's getting warmer. And as anybody has ever been any time in the Northeast, ticks are creatures that nobody wants around, and they carry a lot of diseases. Lyme is just one of them. So you have things like that are migrating around, and then you have birds that are carrying avian flu virus that are moving to new places. There's just a lot as things move around, they carry stuff and they bring it to new places. And it's one of the unspoken, but most, I think, kind of dangerous aspects of these changing heat patterns.
That's a lot that I didn't even think about when it comes to the disease, that these things like malaria, dengue fever that we haven't had to deal with, kind of
Right.
migrating around. And just that when you mentioned Mexico City, these cities that aren't necessarily set up, they may not have the screens, they're not prepared for this. So these are things that people don't have in their mind, that as we see these heat waves really come, we need to be thinking about this stuff. I do want to ask you, I'm going to ask you a couple questions here, but kind of tell us about what life would look like in some of these major cities like Chicago, Boston. Phoenix is one that came up. We're here in Houston, you're in Austin. When we start reaching these kind of, emergency level of heat, tell us a little bit about how those cities will look like.
Well, that's a great question. And I think we've seen hints of it in the last few weeks in Texas. I've certainly seen it in Austin. We had temperatures in Austin of 110, 112. I think that some parts of southern Texas hit a heat index, which is a combination of humidity and heat, of 120 degrees in the last couple of weeks. We've had heat records broken all over Texas, and people say, "Oh, Texas is always hot," and of course it's always hot, but we're seeing records being broken and this heat staying around longer and longer. And this, as we continue to burn fossil fuels and put CO2 into the atmosphere, it is going to get hotter. That is a basic scientific fact, as real as gravity. There's no issue. No, there's no questioning that, right? So, what we saw in the last couple of weeks, just I saw in Austin, people, you don't do things in the middle of the day. You don't go for a run in the middle of the day. You don't you go for a walk early in the morning. All the cafes in Austin, everybody was sitting inside instead of sitting outside. On Father's Day, I wanted to go for a hike with my kids, but instead, we went to a movie because we didn't want to go outside. So you become kind of imprisoned in these air conditioned spaces. But as it gets hotter and hotter, even a few degrees hotter, if it were up to 125 or something, which scientists cannot say, even at the levels of CO2 we have now, that can't happen. It could happen. You'll begin to see, real, visible impacts in the sense of trees dying, plants dying, many more people dying, people who don't have access to air conditioning, who are or can't afford it. Heat is very predatory on vulnerable people and living things, but people especially. So people who have heart conditions, people who are have hypertension, people on various kinds of medications, older people in general, people who are doing outdoor work. I mean, I talked to in Houston. Speaking of Houston, I talked to a city official while I was reporting my book, who said, as the heat rises in Houston, we're going to have to shift all construction to nighttime. So, like, what does that mean? How do you think about that? And how disruptive is that? And how disruptive to the economy of Houston or Texas is it going to be when it gets too hot for outdoor work in the daytime during the summer? So summer becomes this time when you can't do things outside unless you're doing it at night. And we talk about sort of economic impacts of this, and that's huge. I mean, if you begin to think about, oh, we can't build buildings, like we normally do, or construction projects during 3 months of summer because it's too hot. And if we're going to do it, we're going to have to do it at night. That's incredible change in the sort of economic rhythms of our state.
That is, everything that you just said there, 100%, and especially for local listeners, Houston. I mean, the nighttime construction, that all of the things. Even, you mentioned Father's Day, changing your plans. I was up at 7 a.m. with the blower on the roof of my house, getting pine needles off of it because I didn't want to be up in the heat of the
Yeah.
day here. So this is a very real thing. I've got probably two more questions for you before we hit the end of the show here. One, you don't have to answer this one if you don't want to, but because we're in Texas, do you have any opinions as far as the governor, ERCOT, and kind of how the Texas stuff plays into this specific to us?
Well, sure. Two points I would make. One is that, this recent heat wave that we have all lived through, these spike of temperatures in the last few weeks have really, one of the fears, as I mentioned before, was that as the demand for power surges, because everyone's turning up their air conditioning, that we would have a power failure. And, and I talked about the risks and the problems and the dangers of that. Well, we didn't, and that's fantastic. But one of the reasons we didn't was because we have so much solar power in that has been installed in Texas. I think during the heat wave, as much as 25% of the grid power was coming from solar. Solar is much more reliable during these heat extremes. These heat extremes are really tough on traditional thermal plants that have, metal that expands and contracts, and there's all kinds of issues with using a natural gas power plant during extreme heat that solar plants don't have. Plus, so we had a more stable grid, and it was cheaper. You didn't have the price swings that we have with natural gas. The state saved ratepayers in the state saved billions of dollars during this heat wave with a more stable grid because of the solar power on the grid, and that's really, really a big deal, and is a kind of test case for why we need to move more quickly to renewables, why they're a better deal, and Texas is the leader in that. Texas is amazing in their deployment of solar and wind, but it doesn't get talked about enough because, the oil and gas people sort of dominate the politics of the state in such a big way. But I think this is going to be a real turning point in that, and I think that this was a kind of proof positive that this movement is, not only cheaper, not only better for cleaner air, but also more reliable. So that's one point. The other point that I would make politically is that during the midst of all of this, Governor Abbott signed legislation that prohibited local cities from instituting uh, breaks for construction workers for shade and water, right? And the outrageousness of that, just from a sort of purely human point of view, is to me sort of mind-boggling. And I don't know how this is justified or rationalized. I mean, it's partly economic, like we can't afford to, have workers taking breaks, because it raises the cost of projects. Well, okay, then either you have to start moving towards night time so it's cooler, or you're going to have a lot of workers die. And, is that okay? That we have workers dying on construction projects, in the middle of the day because the governor doesn't want to give them a 15-minute water and shade break, you know? So it's bringing up a lot of, pretty, pretty tough political questions.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I'm shaking my head the whole time, yes, because I'm in agreement. So I think we probably have one more time for one more question, but
Sure.
I'm gonna kind of piggyback on what what you're sharing there. We talked a little bit about the idea of the solar and wind, and I've seen some articles that even bringing in these the battery part, that we've gotten a bigger bang for the battery. Backups that are these giant, power stations or whatever. So that's interesting to me. We kind of started with the idea that we're talking about climate change here, and it's okay to say that because we've spent the last 5 years. I'm just kind of like in a blur where it's intellectual shorthand. If somebody doesn't accept the science, I don't want to talk to them because I'm not going to debate you whether gravity is a real thing. Yes, we can have this theoretical study, but we've thought in the past we weren't that, we didn't have to revisit stuff that we already know. So put that aside. Now we know we're seeing some of this stuff roll out, and I'm an optimist, believe it or not, after having these shows. So I'd kind of like to end the show with that. Can you give us some reasons to be optimistic, some possible solutions, some things we probably need to be working towards if we're looking to solve this as a problem? Is that possible? Or are we all screwed? I'll just leave
No,
it with that.
no, well, that's a good question, and one of the things I'm learning as I'm talking to more and more people as this book gets rolled out is, it always comes down to this sort of binary question. It's like, are we screwed or are we not? And my view is, I've been writing about climate change and energy for 20 years, and a lot of people think, why aren't you like an alcoholic living in your basement and like, afraid to come out into the world because it's all so depressing. I don't find it depressing at all. I find it incredibly inspiring. The reason I write about this is because every time I go out to report a book and or a magazine article, I meet amazing people who are doing amazing things, innovative things, creative things, passionately connected. And I'm not talking about tree hugger environmentalists. I'm talking about like the guys who were building the solar panels out in Texas, the guys who were building the batteries, the Tesla. I'm not a huge fan of Elon recently, but that is an amazing story. I mean, I really believe that this climate crisis and these extreme heat waves and all of this energy transition can be used to build a better world. I think that the way that we have our world built is not perfect. Have done a lot of dumb stuff, built things in a lot of dumb ways. We can do better. We can build better cars, have more reliable power, have cleaner air. The problem is that we're deep into this, and there's going to be suffering, and there's going to be loss, and there's going to be death, and we have to grasp the scale of what we confront. This is not a broken ankle that we can just fix with a couple days in a splint. We need to think differently about our lives, and we need to do it soon, and we can do it better. And Texas is a great example. Texas is like a leader in clean energy and a leader in this kind of transformation. But for political and cultural reasons, it doesn't get talked about enough. But if you look at it from a like money making and economic point of view, Texas is like, booming into the future. But it's also one of the places in the country that is at most risk because of climate change. You have the Gulf Coast with sea level rise, floods, increasing strong storms. There's $30 billion being spent on this Ike to protect Houston, right? That they're building. They're going to be building very soon because of the risk of storm surge. Austin is constantly, there's a huge issue with water, in Austin and other Texas cities, right? And that's directly related to climate change. I went to the Rio Grande Valley to, talk to a bunch of farmers and everything. And where the Rio Grande Valley meets the Gulf, it's basically nothing. There is no mouth of the Rio Grande anymore for all intents and purposes because all the water's been sucked away by agriculture and development. And then we have these extreme heat waves that Texas is very vulnerable to. So Texas is like in the bullseye
Right,
in
right.
a good way and in a more like we better get this figured out because we're going to suffer the impacts of it more than any other state in the nation, I would say. But we also have the money, the brains, the skills, the energy background that can lead the transformation, and with tremendous economic upside. There's a lot of money to be made in this transformation, and some of the oil companies and stuff are really starting to get that also. So I feel very optimistic. But I also feel like it's really important for me to try to shatter the binary of are we doomed or are we not. We're in big trouble. We have a
Hmm.
lot to do, and there's going to be a lot of changes in our world. But the sooner we embrace them and get on with it, the better off we're going to be.
I love it. I love it. What a great place to leave it. The book, The Heat Will Kill You First, Life and Death on a Scorched Planet by Jeff Goodell. Jeff, thank you for sharing with us today. Is there anything, I know that this is available on Amazon, and did it release last week or this week? I knew it just came out.
Today, today is
Today. Oh,
today is
hey,
Pub
what
Day.
good time. What
So
a great time. Well, absolutely. Thank you for spending time with us. Anything you'd like to leave the listeners with? Just a closing thought?
no, just that the book is I moved to Texas 4 years ago, and the book a lot of the book is built around Texas, and I love living here, and I hope a lot of people who live in Texas will have a look at the book because I think that I kind of think of it as a kind of survival guide to the 21st century, and I think it can save lives by understanding, the impacts of heat, in more detail, because there's a lot of ignorance out there about how, including my own, about the impacts of heat. So I hope people will have a look at it.
Well, thank you so much. Have a good rest of the day, and thank you again.
Okay.